To participate in this next exercise, you'll have to grab one of these index cards that are on the table that correspond to a particular technology. It looks like film, radio, and television are amongst the remaining ones, and you'll get in small groups and work on those. Here's what I'd like you to do. Find the other people who have the same card as you. Discuss what you learned from the readings, anything that sort of stands out to you, comes to your mind. But then I want you to make a chart, which you can do on the whiteboard or on our blue pieces of paper there, that capture sort of 3 key ideas. First of all, who are all of the stakeholders who are involved in the implementation of this technology? One of the things that I think Larry Cuban is particularly wonderful at is giving you a sense of all of the different hands that touch a technology making its way into a school, and all of the different hands that touch a technology when it's in the school. This is incredibly important for understanding how technologies actually get used. In sort of, a lot of times in like canonical design, I think this comes up in sort of software engineering classes and things like this idea that like there's a programmer and a user. And the user is like one person who's sitting at a keyboard with their fingers on the keyboard, and like that's the person you need to pay attention to. And that like 2-part model of like designer and user totally breaks down in schools. There are lots of people who are very different who could be considered users of technology in schools. Another thing that Larry Cuban does really well is he helps us pay attention to how these people have what I'll call different interests. By interests, I don't mean curiosities. I mean like incentives, stakes, sort of how a political scientist might use the word interest. All of these different stakeholders are rewarded for different kinds of things. They also have what we'll call disinterests or disincentives. They are also trying to avoid or will be punished for different kinds of things. So for the technology that you picked a card of and are talking with your colleagues about, think of all of the different people who you think could be considered stakeholders in the implementation of this thing. And then for each of those stakeholders, come up with like a couple of their interests and a couple of their disinterests or disincentives or things that punish them or those kinds of things. Does that as a general exercise make sense? And the thing that we're trying to do together is we want to try to recreate the world around these technologies. That's what I think Larry Cuban is so fabulous at, is saying like, yep, a television set is going to roll into but it's going to roll into a classroom and into a school and into a community, and there's all these people who are part of that. That's what we really want to get out here. The last thing I'll tell you before I cut you loose is Larry Cuban has a totally fascinating history himself. He was a social studies teacher in the 50s and 60s. Then he was a school principal. Then he was a superintendent. He was actually the superintendent in Arlington, Virginia, which is where my wife went to school. So when my wife was an elementary school student, her superintendent at the time was Larry Cuban. And are you Arlington, Virginia? Fairfax, close enough. Yeah. And it was only after he had like a pretty distinguished career as a teacher, a principal, a superintendent that he went to Stanford, got his dissertation, became a historian of education, and then eventually a history of education professor out there. So he's someone who's like extremely well-read, as I'm sure you got a sense of, and things like that. But he also just deeply understands the kinds of things that make schools tick and make the people inside schools tick. Does this exercise make sense? Find the people with your cards, move yourselves around, make this little chart either on the board or on these blue pieces of paper. Ready, go. Those things are hugely important. You know, where does teaching actually happen? Like there's some human being, you know, who like needs to go to the bathroom and needs to eat. And I mean, here's that great quote in there. It's not about film, but television, that they found that they're more likely to use television in the afternoon than in the mornings. It's all like biology and culture. Like our brains work better in the morning. We're all a little flagging by the afternoon. Those kinds of things. And so yeah, I think anybody who's building a technology has to think to themselves, like, you know, what are the variations in a teacher's day? Like, when do they have more energy or less energy? How does it fit into those kinds of cycles and things like that? Like, those are every bit as real as, you know, the test score goals that we have or anything else. This is really good. Take a few more minutes.
we're trying to think about this interest for schools and for producers.
Sure. So if you're a school, what would make you go, I'm not sure I want to do anything with films? It's 1913. Silent films, started coming out in earnest around the turn of the century. There's a handful of people. The most prominent of them is Thomas Edison. A guy invents the light bulb, and he gets in front of Congress and he says, he's first in 1913. He says, I'll read the other quote, but he says, in a decade, textbooks will be replaced by film strips. That's how powerful this new technology is going to be. If you're a school principal, what would be some things that make you go, you're pretty smart, Thomas, but I'm not so sure about this one?
Maybe if they just put a bunch of money into textbooks.
Sure. So yeah, they have an entire infrastructure built around the existing technologies. They have shelves on the wall. They have libraries full of books. Every one of their teachers has been trained to teach with textbooks, and not a single one of their teachers, when these things are first introduced, has ever been in a class as a student learning from a film. So you have this huge inherent conservatism in the system. So that could be one. What would be some others?
I guess this is kind of adding on to that, but like integrating it into like a classroom setting, like how would they even integrate it to even if they're like completely on board, how would they even integrate it into a classroom?
What for films? What would be some of the challenges of integration?
The technology that you would need to put into a classroom or into a school.
Tell me specifically for films what some of that technology might be.
I don't think the projectors back then could fit into a classroom.
So they could. They're portable enough, but they're big. They're these big lumbering machines for which the rooms are if you have a classroom, let's say you have had a big population growth, and so someone in the 1850s built a school and it was 12 kids per classroom, and now you're putting 18 kids per classroom in there. A totally legitimate reason would be there is not space in this room to physically move this machine. What are some other what else do you need for films as a technology to be able to be implemented? So you need a giant projector. You're going to put the thing on wheels. What else do you need?
A place to actually project it onto.
Okay, good. You're going to have to go to all your classrooms and you're going to have to install screens at the front of the room. Not the hugest challenge, but also not free. So who's going to do these things? The films also came on these huge reels. It wasn't just pick your YouTube channel and play. Where in your building are you going to keep a library of film reels? Who is going to organize those libraries of film reels? If you have 4 elementary schools or 4 elementary classrooms, let's say you have 4 first grades, are you going to buy 4 copies of this film so that everyone can watch it at the same time? If not, how are you going to physically organize and move this giant reel from one space to another? Those are all, you could imagine just the principal being but how are we? And all this stuff costs money. So those are all kinds of, Thomas Edison is here telling you that you're going to get 100% efficient learning through this thing, which is the potential gains, which no one has any evidence for because it hasn't happened yet. But you've got to think to yourself, what are all these costs? What are all these material changes? Yeah. So think about how you can articulate some of those things. But good, when you really get into to do this exercise well, you have to what exactly is this technology? Even physically, what does it require? How many of these things do you need to buy? How much do they cost? All that kind of stuff. How reusable are they? Okay, this is really good. Why don't we take a break here? Go ahead and you can sit back down to the seats that you were at. I think everyone's written kind of broadly enough that we'll be able to see from a distance. But yeah, really good, really good. Now I need to find a little spot for me to.
Everyone's last minute notes.
Yeah. Now's your chance to put the final few things up there. Good. So, what was the minimum number of stakeholders people came up with? These guys are the winners with the longest list. Let's just read it out loud. The state: admin, parents, teachers, students, corporations, manufacturers, EdTech investors, developers, policymakers. Great. So just as a starting point, I mean, there's some other ones that showed up around here: studios, broadcasters, the FCC, that sort of different, psychologists. Yeah, there are a lot of people who have something at stake in these decisions. They're complex, multi-human kinds of decisions. So that's a good start. Let me just read. So given how complex these things are, why are folks so enthusiastic about it? Let's ask Thomas Edison. What does Thomas Edison think about this? I believe that the motion picture is destined to revolutionize our educational system, and that in a few years it will supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. I should say that on the average we get about 2% efficiency out of school books as they are written today. You're laughing. Why are you laughing? Thomas Edison is just here making shit up. He doesn't, 2%, that doesn't mean a thing. He was good at light bulbs. He wasn't maybe as good at this. The education of the future, as I see it, will be conducted through the medium of the motion picture, where it should be possible to obtain 100% efficiency. Thomas Edison, 1922. You'll read a couple of other quotes that I have from Thomas Edison. One of them's in here, in Failure to Disrupt, when you read that. But in 1913, he went in front of Congress and said, in 10 years, the textbook will be entirely replaced by film strips. And then he went back 10 years later in 1923, and he said, in 20 years, textbooks will be entirely replaced by film strips. I think you can find many similar kinds of arguments that are made today. I think you will not have a hard time finding people who would tell you that the old-fashioned techniques are only 2% efficient, but the new ones will be 100% efficient. So that's the promise. The promise is that we could do substantially better than we're doing right now if we think about implementing all of these different kinds of technologies. So an intuition that you can develop is that this is a century-old enterprise. For the last 110 years, people have thought, how can we take analog technologies and eventually digital technologies, bring them into schools to improve learning? There are millions of people who work in education. Many of them are very, very smart. From the earliest, you read a little bit about personal computers, kind of from the 70s and 80s, the Apple II Plus, kind of the generation of computers that I grew up with. But that's actually like 20 years into the game. From the moment people built computers the size of this room, computer scientists, educators, learning scientists partnered together to try to figure out if there's some way to use computers to teach people. So just compute, not even all these other radio, film, other things. Computing alone is like a 70-year enterprise of trying to improve schools. There are lots of things that we've tried and learned in 70 years. So one intuition that I hope you'll take away from this class is that when you're thinking about an education technology problem of any form or type, about a design problem, an implementation problem, a policy problem, you should think to yourself, we probably have done something like this before. There's nothing that is so new, so utterly different that there aren't like cognate examples that could help us think through whatever these challenges are. Let's think about a couple of these stakeholders. Which stakeholders seem to appear pretty much in all of them? Who seem to be sort of universal stakeholders? Teachers. Let's start with them, because they're the best. I love teachers. I mean, definitely one of the reasons why I do what I do is I just think teachers are great. What kinds of things get teachers excited? If you want to get a teacher using education technology, what are the felt needs that they have that are going to be really important to them? This is one that I think will be pretty consistent across a bunch of these, but we can see if there are differences too.
Reducing their workload.
Okay, good. I love it. Reducing workload. Why is that so important to teachers?
Just because they have so much.
They have so much to do. These are not people who spend a bunch of time like sitting around waiting for the phone to ring or something like that. Teacher workload in the United States is actually in certain ways like much higher than in other comparable OECD countries. So OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperative Development, something like that. It's basically like rich countries, 30 or 40 rich countries. American teachers, compared to our colleagues in other countries, spend more time in front of students actually directly teaching than in many other places. So in many other countries in the world, like a full-time licensed teacher would have more collaborative planning time, more grading time, other kinds of things like that. So US teachers, compared to their colleagues around the world, are like behind the ball on having time anyway. Reducing workload is something they care about. What else do they care about?
Like, it has to spark the students' interest?
Good. So they don't want kids to be bored. That one of their core interests is, how am I going to keep these folks motivated? How am I going to keep them learning? What else do they care about?
They care about it being of actually good quality.
Okay, good. So like, it's really important that learning goes up, that quality is high. That teachers take their professionalism very, very seriously, and and they're held accountable in various kinds of ways. And this could be different across different kinds of teachers. So in the United States, we primarily we test. In certain kinds of ways, we test like way more than every other country does. There's no country that tests all of their students every year, 3rd to 8th grade, in both reading and math. Most other countries are like, if you test them in the 3rd grade, you probably wait a couple of years to you give them but you give them assessments or exams or whatever, but you don't give them like big national tests. And so if you are a teacher of reading or of math, your test scores are scrutinized in a way that a science teacher, art teacher, a health teacher, other kinds of teachers are not similarly scrutinized. So within there can be different kinds of incentives. One of the things I always enjoyed about being a history teacher is that there were never really tests that I were preparing my students for. In the same way, I taught in private school, but even my math teacher colleagues felt like they were preparing students for the SAT, for the APs, things like that. That was never really my concern. As a result, I had to spend less time thinking to myself, this new thing I'm bringing into this classroom, is this going to prepare people for some kind of nearly universal testing experiences? Like my math teacher colleagues always had to be thinking about that. I could be like, well, Tibetan Buddhism isn't on the test, but it's awesome. Let's study it. So that's different. Good. Other kinds of things. Yeah, Ty, and then Sabrina.
Accessibility and inclusion. So making sure that no one's left out from your diverse group of learners from any technology.
Yeah. And that would not be a universal concern across these decades. It would have been considered much more common to say certain people have totally unsolvable learning disabilities and society should tend to their welfare in some other kind of way in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And then somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which totally transformed our thoughts and in fact, created a federal right for people to have, a way of being a fair and appropriate public education. And I would also just say as society has gotten more interested in values of inclusion generally. What people would have worried about with inclusion with personal computers in the 1980s is very different for what they'd be worried about with the computers that are getting in front of their students right now. That's a great one.
I'm going to say being able to track student progress.
Track progress. Assessment. Good. Yeah, I mean, actually interesting over this century. Some of the earliest technologies had nothing to do with that, radio and film, but one of the very earliest ones you read about, physical teaching machines. And hopefully you saw some pictures. I was just actually looking today. There was Sidney Pressey is one of the people who Audrey Waters writes about. And there's somebody on YouTube who had posted this fabulous 2-minute clip of him demonstrating one of his teacher machines. And unfortunately that account was deleted before this year's class. Maybe I'll send you a version of it later. The only version of the video that still exists is one in which Anand Agarwal's voice is superimposed of it. So somebody took an audio clip of Anand Agarwal talking about the capacities of edX and played the audio over Sidney Pressey demonstrating the teaching machine. It's a little too close for comfort, even though it's a century apart. But teaching machines, they were kind of like typewriters. They had these 4 keys that were on them, and so they would display one question at a time. It was like pre-Scantron technology, and then there would be one of 4 possible answers. It's one of the earliest versions. It had a little bank of mints in the back of them, and so when you press the right button, a little candy or something would roll out and give you a little behaviorist positive reinforcement kinds of things. But one of the main virtues of it was oh man, if we could get enough people these things, then we could assess their progress almost constantly. We'd know exactly where they are. So this idea of tracking student progress is something that's particularly urgently concerned in our data-driven world, but was still something that people were interested in a century ago. What are some of the? I'll just put them under here. What are some of the would be disincentives for teachers? What are some things that if you were trying to get teachers to adopt new technologies would be the sorts of things that would be barriers for them?
Complexity.
Why complexity?
A lot of there's some teachers who are more able to adapt to new technologies, and some teachers who just cannot understand how certain technologies might work.
Yeah, so I think that aptitude is right. I also like if you go into teaching, there are probably two things that really drive you. One is you love the content that you teach. That's more true for secondary educators than for early elementary educators, but probably true for them. And you probably love people. Very difficult to be a teacher if you don't find people, especially young people, pretty engaging. The kinds of folks who find people engaging, they might just find, it's not 100% overlap, but there's just technology is less engaging. Like they didn't want to spend their life sitting in front of a computer typing stuff. They wanted to be interacting with people. But the other thing I would say is that there are many educators who spent a lot of time polishing their craft and are good at teaching the way they're teaching right now and have been teaching for the last decade. And so when they see a new piece of technology come in, they're thinking to themselves, is this thing really going to be better than the thing that I've been doing and got good at for a while? I'm going to have to lose something when I integrate this new thing. Like any technology adoption involves loss. Any change involves loss. You got to give something up. I think giving up, it may be pretty good. I think a lot of people think that older teachers are less likely to adopt technologies because they're not technology fluent. But having worked with many, many teachers, I'm really convinced that there's no relationship between age and technology adoption. There are young teachers that are super interested, and there are young teachers who hate it. There are old teachers who are like, I'm pretty good at what I do, and there are old teachers who are old teachers because they've spent the last 20 years going, it's really fun to try new things. It's really fun to try to get better. What was one of your disincentives, Sabrina?
Student distraction.
Great. And obviously some of these technologies are more akin to that than others. Like if you're playing a film strip or something like that, like you probably have kids' attention or things like that. But certainly as we get into computers, anything in which the attention is where each student is responsible for their own attention is something that can raise concerns for teachers because kids like to be attend to all kinds of things. What other things would be disincentives?
Like teacher displacement, like they feel like they're being replaced.
Yep. So teachers are a profession, that protects their job security with a license and things like that, like lots of other professions do, like doctors and pharmacists and lawyers and all kinds of people. But most professionals are not super enthusiastic about technology that has the capacity to replace the functions that they're doing. Good. Let's think about some of these other. So this is a good one. So again, we could think about any time a new technology is being introduced, is it going to reduce workload? Is it going to spark interest? Will it spark interest in the first 3 weeks of this new technology being here? Will it spark interest 2 years after the technology has been introduced? Is it going to be of high quality? Do I have control over the quality? Accessible inclusion, is it going to improve learning? Will it be able to track assessment? Is it too complex? Will it distract my students? Is it going to displace essential functions that I perform? That is a good set of questions that you could ask, that Cuban does ask in some ways of radio and film and television and teaching machines and computers. And you could ask them of AI and Khan Academy and iCivics and anything else that comes along. These are all still good questions to ask. Let's try to hit now a bunch of these other stakeholders. Who are some of the stakeholders that surprised you? Who are the ones that you were like, whoa, I wouldn't have thought of this in terms of education technology? Weird ones or unique ones?
I mean, I thought my group was the teacher machines, and it was the psychologists that come up with the ideas that go into how these technologies are what they're based on. I guess I never really thought it is the people who thought of constructivism and situated learning that has then sparked this interest in everything else. And so it's people have ideas, but all of that initially stemmed from these 2000 learning.
Good. Yeah. So people have ideas about what good teaching and learning should be like. Those ideas are in some ways, they seem pretty universal because we can find them going back through history. But they're always being reinterpreted, updated, things like that. Sidney Pressey is in this moment where behaviorism is an incredibly prominent set of ideas. This behaviorism you're probably all familiar with. Of you punish people when they do things wrong and you reward them when you do things right, and you condition their behavior that way. And so he creates a physical machine that embodies those ideas. And then Seymour Papert will come along and be like, oh man, why can't we learn math the way that like kids who go to visit France learn French? Why can't we make a thing which is Mathland? I bet Logo could be like Mathland. He has a set of ideas about what good teaching and learning looks like, and he incorporates those ideas. And people become partisans of these ideas. Probably the most prominent partisan of education technology in the United States today is Sal Khan, who's someone who like had a very particular idea, like a clear vision of what personalized learning would look like. He had I don't know if you know about his personal experience, but he was like a hedge fund person or something like that, and his niece was having trouble with math, and he started tutoring his niece in math, and he did it over videos, and so he put the videos online. People started watching them. He go, wow, what if every person could have this little like personalized tutor? What if each person could sort of study math at their own individual pace? And then he built this whole enterprise and continues to, he's incredibly enthusiastic about AI right now because like, oh man, instead of just having me record a tutor for each person, like what if the GPT can like generate personalized text related to each individual person or something like that? And those ideas, it's not like they're just dropped in the world, they're advocated for. Did you all see the New York Times, was it New York Times or Washington Post? Somebody wrote an op-ed about Sal Khan and AI. It was either in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but it was basically something like, this is the first AI that your kid will love or something like that. And it's basically just a sort of celebratory piece of Khan-Migo. Good, so that's an unusual group, and those groups, today they like Sal Khan goes on the Today Show and tells people what he thinks. He goes to investor conferences and tells people what he thinks. He goes to schools, Harvard and MIT bringing him in every couple of years and things like that. So these folks advocate for their ideas. They're not, the ideas just don't fall from the sky. There's a stakeholder who is advancing those ideas. Who are some other stakeholders that seem important?
I thought it was weird that you could think about like manufacturers, and I mean like the people who produce transistors, which is like TSMC and ASML, because if a bunch of schools across America all of a sudden need like thousands and thousands of iPads, then you have like this big backlog request on like M2 chips or whatever is in them right now. And then someone like TSMC, the only people who really produce transistors, has this huge load and they make a lot of money.
Yeah, that people become, that those folks then organize themselves into trade groups, and they go to, how do they advance their interests? They do things like give some of their materials away for school as demonstration. They create training programs for their materials and share them. They have sales and marketing people that go around and get people advanced about that. They like sponsor conferences. They, maybe that they're not even directly advertising for. They're just, their presence to try to encourage teachers and other sorts of groups to be behind it. We spend an enormous amount of money on education every year in the United States, and the biggest chunk of that money goes to pay the salaries of the people who do stuff, and another big chunk of that money goes to heating and air conditioning, for which there are people who are selling those things. But basically the third biggest bucket after those two is the stuff we buy in schools to help people learn. There are advocates who are, the folks who are not neutral in these things. There are ways, Apple Computer has been particularly prominent over the last bunch of years in trying to craft a vision of itself as a company that has a particular role inside colleges, universities, schools, those kinds of things.
I think something that surprised me, but maybe it's not that surprising, was like governments as a whole and like elitism between governments, because in the class we took last semester, like Intro to Education, we talked a lot about like Americanism and how like it's so linked with education. And I know it's such a big thing to be like, oh, like this country has like the biggest amount, or like, the highest SAT score on average, or like this many people use Khan Academy or something like that. So sometimes it really is just like governments competing against each other and trying to see like who's the best of the best.
Great. And in the United States, when we talk about government actors, what are all the different possible government actors we might be thinking about? So there's a U.S. Department of Education. Who else is there?
So local boards of education.
So there's local boards of education. So a very unusual thing about the United States Department of Education or the United States education system is it's extremely decentralized. There are 130,000 schools and there are 13,000 school districts. The modal elected official in the United States is a school board member. There are more, if you're an elected official in the United States, the thing you are most likely to be is a school board member. School board members are interesting stakeholders. They are, and they range from community to communities. In lots of communities, they're just like a community member who's particularly interested in education. But there are also people who are looking to, it's an entry point for people who are interested in political careers. Lots of people who are school board members go to be on state reps and other kinds of things like that. This is a particularly sort of fecund moment for people who are politically ambitious to pursue those ambitions through the school system, especially in the American right, where reform of schools has become like a way to get kind of attention within the political party and things like that. And yeah, there's all kinds of towns across the country where. And I think you get some of this is like some school board is like, what would be really great is film strips. Like, let's go big on film strips. What would be really great is like closed circuit television. Wouldn't that be a useful thing to have? And so it's not even like, it's not the teachers, it's not the superintendents, it's not the people who are sort of in the schools, it's like some community members who are like, let's do it. In the United States today, there's probably two versions of that. There are definitely school boards whose identity is sort of shaped around like being a cutting edge school, like in a bunch of the affluent suburban towns around Boston, like Wellesley, Newton, like they want to be thought of as having like really great cutting edge forward thinking schools. Newton spent $200 million or something like that on the last high school that they built. And so it can be a way to become a school board member is like, I'm going to help the school system modernize and embrace technology and things like that. There can also be the opposite. There can also be people who come in, the most common is like people who work for the technology industry who are like, you have no idea how much surveillance is built into this technology. All the time when I talk to principals or superintendents who are being like, we're kind of having a hard time helping parents understand why these things would be useful. It's like someone who works for Google or Microsoft or something like that, who like who knows the surveillance capacity of these tools and is concerned about it. Yeah.
I just kind of have like an anecdote to
Yeah.
illuminate that too.
Please.
So I used to work in EdTech and educational publishing, and I worked on mostly products for the state of Florida, and like really showed how much power some of these districts have. Like because if the school board would make a decision like every several times, or one or two districts in Florida would suddenly say they need something, and that would change the entire roadmap for a product that's used nationally. And so it's like you have a couple people in Florida who are like, we really need this thing, and then suddenly it's like kids in Arkansas are also
are learning differently. So this is definitely still true. It's breaking down a little bit because of the capacity for sort of web publishing and custom publication. But for a big chunk of what you might, I don't know, the latter third of the 20th century, the first 10 years of the 21st century, publishers would publish a U.S. history book. How do they decide what to make of a U.S. history book? You say, well, like, what are the most important states to sell this history book in? Florida is one of them. What are the other ones? You can name them. California? Texas, New York. California, Texas, New York, Florida. Those are like four of the most important states just by population. So now you got to think about like the standards of every state has standards. The history standards of those four states are more important than the history standards of Maine and North Dakota. And as like political things come up around, history is where this happens pretty frequently, but it happens in math and reading and other things too. Yeah, actually, I used to do consulting for for publishers of history textbooks, and once I saw the sort of matrix where it was like all the possible topics along the columns and all of the states along the rows, and like X's of like where all the topics get taught. The other thing is for like there'll be a huge, group of Polish immigrants that come to some state, and like they won't see Polish people represented in their textbooks, and so they'll be like, we're only going to adopt books that like talk about the importance of Polish Americans in the history. And then publishing companies are like, all right, add the Polish, but then the Italians do it, and the Cambodians do it, everybody else do it, and the textbooks get, that's why when you picked up your 800-pound history textbook, it was full of like all these like weird little bits and pieces and things like that. So yeah, these state level, I mean, here's another like tiny feature of this, but ends up being important. There are some states, mostly in the South, where material adoptions happen centrally or have some kind of centralized function. So Texas, Florida, they have state level boards that say you can only adopt books that pass these boards. Massachusetts is a huge local control state. The school districts in Massachusetts would go bonkers if the state tried to tell them which textbooks they could or could not use. There'd be like another revolution. There'd be one if by land, two if by, C-class Mercedes or whatever it is, They just wouldn't allow it. But it means that those states that have this sort of centralized function actually end up having more influence over the publishers, because they say, look, you want to sell a book here? And now it's not just a book, now it's a web program or things like that. Now the thing that sort of like is breaking away some of that monopoly, although also causing kind of problems, is, states can say like, okay, we want to, we're going to pass all these laws that have the effect of like way ramping down the teaching of Black history. And publishers can be like, all right, well, your web version of that will delete this and this and this and this, but over in New York or California and liberal states, you can have all that kind of stuff in there. Yeah, Khalil?
Yeah, kind of like going off of that, like the political platforms play a large role in most of these places. In the US, that's very much there, but as an example from my own country, like there at every public school they have like a speaker system at the start of the school, specifically because they want to play the national anthem. That's something they really early. The kids have to do it, and to there's so much technology that just one thing. Why is this the only piece of? There is some kind of incentive they want to build with kind of political motives.
And then does that broadcast system be used at other parts of the day as well, or? It
only gets used at the start of the school, where the national anthem and some kids, every classroom does a session where they just do some religious stuff, some Arabic poems, some fun facts, and then just that. But that's mostly just.
I love that. I think that's a fabulous example. So the whatever the state government is, the state is in the nation. The nation state government says every school must broadcast the national anthem every day. Every single school in the country then has to build a technology infrastructure that allows that to happen. And then once that technology infrastructure is there, it can be used in other kinds of ways as well, or not used, or other kinds of things like that. You can find national examples of this in other kinds of ways. One of the most interesting countries right now for education policymakers to watch is Estonia. About every decade, some country that people aren't really paying attention to gets really good international test scores. So Singapore was it for a while, Finland was it for a while, people are obsessed with Finland for a while, and Estonia is kind of last, who are you people, and why are you so good at reading? And Estonia is very famous for it. Sometimes it's called Estonia. Their government has really embraced the internet in a very centralized kind of way. And so people are looking at and thinking about how education technologies are adopted in Estonia and other kinds of ways. But it wasn't a policy that was just for the schools. They were like, we're going to put Estonia on the map by having really good digital government services. And that national policy decision ends up affecting the learning experiences of kids in schools in all kinds of places. Yeah, that's a great example. Students, what are the interests and disincentives of students?
It's cool. It's a new piece of technology.
Okay, so almost all of us like novelty. That is one of the advantages that technology has. One of the, although an amazing thing about novelty is how shockingly quickly it wears off. Actually, I was reading this on Reddit the other day. A teacher was being I brought a Nintendo Switch into class so we could play these mathematical logic games. And my students were like, oh, please, miss, can we just do worksheets? And I was like, fine, do worksheets then. but they're like, oh man, you want to play some online game? I don't want to play. Now there would have been some moment that this class would be like, what? We can play a computer game in class? This is amazing. But that is, it's an interesting feature of education technology adoption that like novelty can be extremely compelling for a short period of time and then wear off pretty quickly.
Do you have any comment on like why students' default is now back to that pen and paper, like the way, like, because I mean people are always like, education has been the same for decades, and why does it always look this way even after we've reformed it? Like, why is the default that pen and paper?
Good. So, let's just highlight an important thing that you observed, which we were talking about over here too, which is just schools are incredibly conservative institutions. Why would that small c conservative, not right wing, some of them are, but the small c conservative, they do things the same way over and over again. What are some possible reasons for that? One is, if you went and interviewed parents and said, who are another stakeholder that a bunch of people brought up, how much do you want us experimenting with your children? The answer to that is going to be pretty low. Like the enthusiasm that people have for experimenting on children is low. Second, everyone in the educational system who's an adult has what's been sometimes called the apprenticeship of observation. You all have been in school somewhere between like 13 and 18 years. And that shapes your experience. And so people who have roughly the same education level as you go into schools and become teachers, and they bring that 13, 18, 20 years of educational experience with them, and that shapes the way you think schools should unfold. Parents can bring those expectations in. I will never forget this. I was conversing with a school in Utah that was trying to switch to openly licensed materials. It was pretty, I don't know, 15 years ago, 18 years ago, something like that. They were trying to get away from textbooks and to have people use digital materials, particularly digital materials that their teachers could edit, so that they could make them, tailored to their students and things like that. And they said, but they still kept textbooks in classroom. And I can't tell you whether or not it's true, but he says, the reason why we keep textbooks in classrooms is that if there aren't textbooks in classrooms, parents will be upset. That parents, when they go into a classroom, expect to see textbooks there. Basically, it was cheaper to keep buying enough textbooks to be in all of the classrooms than it was to like hire administrators to explain to parents why there weren't textbooks in the classroom anymore. So all of these different stakeholders, this sort of conservative vision of education is kind of part of that. One possibility is that that's really bad. That there are actually like way better ways of doing things that are out there, and it's a bummer that we're so conservative, and that's really holding us back. Another possibility is that the practices that exist in schools have been refined over decades and centuries, and they are the way they are because they're pretty darn good. That we keep doing certain kinds of things because they work. So you'll have to figure out for yourself, as if you hear examples of students kind of adopting old practices, are they adopting those practices because they work really well and because they like them, because they're comfortable and familiar? There's an argument that particularly in our age where students are sort of fixated on grades and performance in a way that they might have not been in decades past because, not because kids are like more materialistic or something, it's because of economic uncertainty. Because as the gap between wealthy and poor people widens and the stakes of education become higher, people become more fixated on it. And so those kids who are sort of adopting familiar matters, like, do they really like the familiarity or do they know how to do well in the familiarity and things like that? But again, like all the, keep tying all the things we were talking about back to the decision of educators trying to implement new technologies. Everyone in your system is going to have some kind of conservative impulse all the way down to students. That conservative impulse might be balanced by the novelty effect that we're talking about, but it's in there. So if you want a new technology to really be adopted in some kind of meaningful way, one strategy you can have is to have it align with existing practices. You could say, let's take technologies that do the kinds of things that are already happening in schools. Like that will be less upsetting, that'll require less training, that'll require less upset. It probably also won't help that much. The people selling the technologies won't say that, but if you're just like digitizing existing practices, how likely are you to have substantial gains from digitizing existing practices? Or maybe you're like a big ambitious reformer, you say, no, we could be doing so much better. We could go from 2% to 100% efficiency in schools. We just have to make big changes in our practice. Well, making big changes in practice requires convincing people to change all of these things. I've read this book a zillion times now, but I was just revisiting a line in here that I loved. It was, he says something towards the end that were like, settings have plans for their inhabitants. Anybody remember that? He was talking about the physical layout of a classroom. But he was using a broader sociological principle. Settings have plans for their inhabitants. People interact in a space in a certain way because the physical space is laid out and built in that way. So I was talking with these guys about one of the problems that film strips have. To have a film strip in your classroom, you have to take a giant projector on wheels and you have to roll it into the space. There would have been some classrooms, filled with, early 20th century, urban schools with tons of immigrants who are pouring in on America's shores that don't have room in their classroom for a big thing. The other thing that film strips had that was a huge pain is these giant film reels. The early film reels were really, really big. Where are you going to put these things? Your town did not build a building that had like, an archival film studio storage unit attached to it. Let's say you have a big school and there are 4 first grade classes and you want to buy a film strip for all 4 of those are you going to buy 4 copies of the same film strip? Like, is each classroom going to have its own film library? If it has some centralized library, you have to have some way of like tagging, archiving, maintaining those things, bringing into classrooms. I mean, there are contemporary versions of all of these things. You want to give every kid a device? How is that kid's device going to get on the network? How is they going to be able to log in? Who's going to deal when they lose their password? What's going to happen when their devices break? Are you going to make families pay for the devices they break? Your kids are super poor. They can't afford that. So you're going to contract with an insurance company? Who on your staff has experience contracting with insurance companies to insure computing devices? Like, you didn't learn that at your, we'll talk with the education school deans on Wednesday, but I'm pretty sure they're not teaching their students how to manage insurance contracts and things like that. All of those things become, they have a combination of incentives and disincentives that are associated with them. Good. Any of these other people that it seems like it's important for us to touch on before we come to the conclusion? We talked about parents. I don't know that how much we talk. Maybe there's one last thing that we could sort of talk about. We talked a little bit about school administrators, but like a thing to be particularly attentive to in schools is just how many different kinds of adults with different roles there are. So we talked about teachers. There are people who are school principals. Like, if you're a school principal, what are the most urgent concerns that you have on any given day? What are the main incentives you have as a school principal?
Your budget?
Yep, you got to make sure you can pay for everything. A teacher's not worried about that. Teacher will buy as much, if the school will pay for it, they'll take as much technology as they want. Some of them, but principals have to balance a budget. The weird thing is, in the United States, it may not at all be a principal's role to balance a budget. It may be entirely a district role. So there are some school districts where the district will make all the purchasing decisions. There are other districts where the districts will take big chunks of money, send it down to schools, and say, schools, make all the purchasing decisions. What else is super important for principals?
I was gonna say, just maintaining the school building itself for student safety.
Yep. Student safety, maintaining the physical school building, making sure things are running and operating and stuff like that.
Are they also managing the relationships with the district and also parents, all these outside?
Yep. So they are, principals are sort of quintessential organizational behavior middle managers. They're empowered to do some things, but not others. They're accountable to lots of different kinds of stakeholders. There's all kind of complexity in what they're doing. A lot of them are pretty keyed, are evaluated based on test scores, especially in places where where students are at risk of not passing tests. And depending upon the policy infrastructure, test scores really matter to them. Safety and the orderly operation of schools, every person in the building wants schools to be orderly, but when schools are disorderly, the person who has to deal with it the most is an assistant principal or the principal. It's just more work for them. You let all the kids have phones, and fights break out and all kinds of things happen. It's teachers have to deal with it, but the principals really have to deal with it.
I just really short comment. Just when you asked us what does a principal do, I've been around them my entire life, and I was I can only think of 2 or 3 things that I know a principal actually does. And I just think it's really strange that most people aren't sitting you down and being this is the person you go to for X, Y, and Z things. And,
yeah.
Around these organizations.
Good. So I think there are a few things that you can grasp from that insight. First of all, schools are just unbelievably complicated. I've spent the last 20 years basically doing nothing but thinking about schools, and I still don't understand all the things that are going on in there. They are like, if you want, like, just as an ecosystem, they're unbelievably complex and fascinating. The second is, as you transition, if you decide to work, be involved in education, you kind of have to like relearn all this stuff going from a student to being someone who's working in education. Like there's all kinds of things that were hidden from you, masked from you, or just sort of weren't important to you. You know, if like the odds that any of you were like real troublemakers is pretty low, given that you're at MIT. But you know, there's a classroom full of people sitting somewhere that like knew principals pretty intimately because they spent a bunch of time in their office because of things that they did and so forth. So good, yeah. If part of what happens to you in this class is a lot of times in social science we talk about making the familiar unfamiliar. A thing that you've looked at your whole life and being like, whoa, look at all these things there that I wasn't sort of paying attention to, or wasn't made aware to me, and those kinds of things. Maybe here's one very concrete thing. Let's think of something like a student information system. Or Canvas. Let's think of something like a learning management system. Who spends the most time using Canvas? Tell me about the people who use Canvas. Students. Students spend a lot of hours logged in looking at stuff on Canvas. Who else looks at Canvas?
Teachers.
Teachers. Who buys Canvas? Not students and teachers. In business school, I think they would call this a third-party payer problem. So if you are a company that's making a learning management system, who's like, of your stakeholders, who has the most power to determine whether or not your thing gets purchased? Like some director of education technology or something like that, some IT person. So if you've ever wondered, like, why is this so terrible? It wasn't built for you. In some important ways, it was literally not built for you. It was built to solve the problems of some middle-level information technology manager who's going to buy one of those things. So third-party payer problems are rife across. I mean, the problem with third-party payer problems, and from like a classical economics point of view, is you just have misaligned incentives. In some respects, you could say that improving the teaching and learning experience on Canvas is a cost. It's something that like reduces your profit. Obviously, you have to make it good enough so that, if like enough teachers and stuff are rolled. Any of you ever have to use Blackboard? Okay, good. I once met the guy who made Blackboard, and I was just standing there in line behind him or something like that, being like, what would it be like to have made a piece of software that millions of people hate? Like what would it have been like to like introduce so much unhappiness in the world with what you've built? Like, and it would have been rude, I think, in the buffet line to ask him that question. Here's another thing that I want to say about who buys these things, and this is really important too, especially to any of you who are interested in either in education, like starting an education startup or other kinds of things. Who in a school can buy technology? What are some possible titles of people who buy technology? We've mentioned a few of them.
Librarians.
A librarian could buy technology?
Department chair.
A department chair could buy technology?
Teacher.
A teacher? They're amongst the least likely. Actually, sometimes people have made the argument that a problem in the education system is it's very difficult to have a real sort of bottom-up marketplace kind of effect. Like teachers have, in most places, teachers have very few discretionary dollars to decide. I mean, that's why they're like holding bake sales and asking, like, when you become parents, like your teachers will ask you to bring in boxes of tissues and things like that. And you'll be like, what broken, failed country do we live in where you cannot simply buy all the tissues that you need for the children?
Or paper.
Paper.
We got 2 reams.
Two reams of paper a semester for all your students. All right, so the teachers don't have, in some cases they do, but in a lot of cases teachers don't have money. Principals can buy things. Directors of instructional technology can buy things. Assistant superintendents can buy things. Superintendents can buy things. School boards in some places can directly authorize kinds of things, although it's probably more rare, but they can push for it. But the point is, across the 13,000 school districts and 130,000 schools in this country, the answer to the question, who can buy something, is different in all of those contexts. That makes starting an education technology company very, very difficult. When you go somewhere, you don't even know who can buy the thing. Like you don't even know who you're selling it to. Now, there are people who do know who buys all these things. The only people in the United States who know for every school and every district who has the power to buy stuff are giant publishers. Pearson, Houghton Mifflin, what was the company you work for? McGraw-Hill. They have an army of salespeople. This army of salespeople have fanned out across the 13,000 school districts, and once a month, once a quarter, all the people who I just listed who can actually buy things, they take them out to lunch. They bring them free supplies. They do all that stuff. They, they probably don't have a master list somewhere. Instead, they have all these salespeople who know the answers to these questions. So if you're a Silicon Valley startup and you're like, oh, I know I've got this new AI thing I'm building. It's super cool. Da da da. You don't have this massive network of sales connections to help you figure this out. One of my favorite illustrations of this is at a bunch of education technology conferences. How many of you have been to a conference where they have you have a badge, right? And you can put stickers on your badges or other things like this. Basically, one of the stickers you can put on your badge, you can put your pronouns, you can put some other things like that. You can put buyer. You can basically signal to people I actually have the power to purchase things. And then when you when you walk through the exhibit hall, they will pay more attention to the people who have the little buyer things on them than they will to critical social science researcher badge is put on your thing or something like that. So that is an incredible, here are some things that you should take away. These systems are incredibly complicated. There are all kinds of stakeholders in them, but they're not so infinite, they're not so complex that we can't make a chart that sort of manages and starts to understand all these things. But as we move forward and as we look at more sort of, a thing that you can do in any kind of education technology problem, any educational setting, be like, all right, who are going to be the stakeholders for this problem, this thing, and what are going to be their interests? The more, and not, again, not just their official interests, their official state policy interest is to raise test scores or something like that. But one of my favorite examples we're talking about is televisions were more likely to be used at the end of the day because people were tired. Your body's circadian rhythm indicates how technologies be used in classroom. And that is just as real. It is just as real as the policy mandate to raise test scores or the school board's enthusiasm for technology or whatever it is. And so we can, in any kind of system, we can figure out who are the stakeholders in the system, what are the interests of those things, what are the disinterests. A thing is more likely to work if it attends to those real, meaningful, felt interests, and if it avoids those real, meaningful, felt disinterests. And of course, we're doing this in a very detailed way in education, but if you were to leave education and you were to go into healthcare, if you were to go into legal technology, if you were going to retail, you can do the exact same exercise. The technology that you're building for a hospital, it has to work for a doctor, but it has to work for a nurse and an orderly and a patient and the patient's representative and the hospital's lawyers and all these different kinds of people. And so, on the one hand, especially when people are designers of software, we can have the sense of oh, I'm building things for a user. I'm building things for this individual user who's got their fingers on their keyboard or their thumb on the screen or something like that. But I would encourage you, as we're thinking through all these things, to think about these networks of interests and stakeholders much more broadly. Okay. We'll talk to some education school deans on Wednesday. We'll learn a little bit about implementation, how you overcome some of these kinds of challenges. From me, we'll hear a little bit about the National Education Technology Plan, and I will pair you up with each other to be able to do some peer editing of your essays, and that will get us through the week. Sound good? Bueno, let me know if I can help you with anything. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.